Hello, in today's video, we're going to be discussing the crucifixion of Jesus and his resurrection, as it's talked about in the Gospels. That's particularly fitting as I'm making this video on the morning of Good Friday, which is the day where Christians around the world are celebrating Christ's death, Jesus' death, and leading up to Easter Sunday this weekend. So hopefully you will see this in conjunction with perhaps your own families or church's celebration of this. Obviously, a strange celebration in this bizarre and difficult time of Corona, but an opportunity nonetheless to celebrate this central event, not only in the Gospels, but Christians believe in all of human history. So it's sometimes typical to, when talking about Jesus' death on the cross, to really focus in or zero in on just how horrifically painful and awful crucifixion was. And I want to be clear, it truly was a horrific way to kill people. And it was a way that the Roman Empire used not only to execute prisoners, but to terrorize the general population. In fact, most historians would say that that's probably the primary function that crucifixion had. So I want to stress, Jesus was not by any stretch of the imagination the only person in history killed on a cross. On the day he dies, the Gospels tell us about two other criminals that are crucified with him. But the reality is, during the course of the Roman Empire, they killed thousands upon thousands of people, typically men, on crosses. And this was a common execution style for the Roman Empire. And again, kind of the point being that it was a way to strike terror and humiliation into conquered peoples, into conquered populations. So crucifixion was very public. People were crucified in public places, along roadsides, community squares or whatnot. And it was brutal. It was a very painful and agonizing way to die. And it lasted a very long time. Often crucifixions, people being crucified would suffer for days before finally dying. Jesus only lives less than a full day on the cross before he dies, most likely because he had been beaten so brutally kind of during the course of his trial, as we discussed in the last video, that he's in a profoundly weakened state by the time he gets to the cross. So the only real thing about kind of the physical dynamics of the cross that I want to highlight is how one dies on a cross is essentially by suffocation. Okay, so like imagine if you are standing at your full height and then forced to squat or bend, to fit into a space that's maybe a foot and a half shorter than is appropriate for your height. That would be an uncomfortable position to be in, right? Like whether you bend at the knee, bend at the waist, like your legs would start to cramp after a period of time being in that squatted position. And that's how crucifixion looked. Like you would be nailed to a cross, and the nails, obviously, that's tremendously painful, but you don't die from bleeding to death or anything like that on the cross. What happens is you are cramped into this frame that is smaller than your body ought to be. It's not at all comfortable. You're not standing straight up or hanging to your full height out on the cross. You're kind of cramped into this space, and your legs begin to cramp, and you begin to have spasms in your legs. So and it's also difficult to breathe. Like as you're kind of hanging, the weight of your shoulders and rib cage are kind of pressing against your lungs, and you have difficulty breathing. So periodically, you would push up against the nails driven into your feet and ankles and kind of stand up to allow your lungs room to expand. And for a couple moments, you can catch some breath, but that's incredibly painful. And so you would, and exhausting. So you would collapse, and then this process would just repeat over and over again of kind of, collapsing onto, with gravity kind of pulling you down. Your lungs begin to fill. You have a difficult time breathing. You push up and catch as much breath as you can, but that's your muscles cramp, and it's exhausting. You collapse back down, and eventually you just become so exhausted you can no longer press up against the spikes and gather breath. And you eventually just kind of stay in that collapsed state, and your lungs eventually fill with fluid, and you kind of suffocate, is what happens on the cross. And the reason I want to talk about that at all, one is just to kind of clarify what exactly is happening in a crucifixion, but mostly to highlight what we're going to do in this video, which is talk about several statements Jesus makes on the cross. Because every breath he takes is precious here, right? Like he does not, he's not hanging on the cross having, hours long conversations with passersby. Like this isn't a place where conversation is possible, where so just to highlight, every single thing Jesus says is incredibly important in this time and incredibly costly. Like he doesn't have breath to spare. He doesn't have conversation to spare. And so what is it that he says on the cross? So I want to look at two comments he makes in the Gospel of Luke before turning to a comment that Jesus makes in the Gospel of Matthew. And then we're going to unpack that Matthew comment a bit more. So the first statement that Jesus makes in Luke is a very famous one, as he hangs on the cross and the crowd begins to jeer him. So there's Roman soldiers that are kind of mocking him, but there's also crowds of Jews that have kind of become disillusioned with him. They're now convinced he's not the Messiah, and they're ridiculing him as he hangs there, right? So these are humans who Christians believe Jesus helped create, right? Like if Jesus was with God in creation, if Jesus, is part of the Trinity that made everything that exists, these are human beings that Jesus knows intimately and helped give life to, and now they're laughing at him, spitting on him, ridiculing him, right? And imagine if you were in a situation like that. Like I can hesitate to, picture if I were in that situation, if I were naked, in incredible pain, being laughed at, being mocked, being ridiculed, and I had any words to say to the people doing that to me, they would not be the words Jesus chooses. I'm sure I would, let loose with as intense a profanity as I could in the short moments that I had air to breathe and to speak. And yet Jesus hangs on the cross and prays to God. And he calls God Father. He says, Father, forgive them, for they have no idea what they're doing. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing, right? So a couple things are important with us. Jesus is still, we last left him in the garden where he was praying to God, if it's possible, I don't want to do this, take this cup from me. But now Jesus is praying and saying, God, forgive these people. They're just ignorant, right? Like the evil, horrific things they're doing to me, yelling at me, spitting at me, are just out of their ignorance and foolishness. And please have mercy on them, right? Like early in the semester, I talked about Hesed, God's steadfast love, and that it will not relent. It's this Wolverine love that, kind of latches on and will not let go. Well, here is Jesus dying on the cross, right? In incredible pain, the object of ridicule. And yet what response that elicits in him is Hesed. He still is calling out to his Father, have mercy, show love, show Hesed to these people, show mercy to these people. Okay, so that's the first comment from Luke that I think is important and just speaks to, how God feels about us, how God expressed through Jesus is still moving towards humanity and love. And then further into the afternoon, there's Jesus has a conversation with the two thieves that are hanging next to him. We're not going to highlight that at this point. But to say that again, Jesus shows mercy and compassion, particularly to one of the thieves who's being killed alongside him. But his final words on the cross in the Gospel of Luke are, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Right. So a couple things there. One, he still is feeling this connection with God the Father. The Trinity is still functioning here at the cross. Jesus is praying to God his Father, and he is giving his life up. Right. There's not a sense here that he is being murdered, but he even on the cross has this awareness that this is a choice that he is making, right? That he is handing his life over to God, and with that he dies on the cross. And why I've kind of focused on these two statements, first being the first statement kind of highlighting Jesus's mercy, is because of the statement from Matthew that I now want to turn to. So in Matthew, as Jesus hangs on the cross, he makes this statement: my God, why have you forsaken me?" Right? As he hangs on the cross, he shouts out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And certain kind of Christian theologies have been built around this statement. Perhaps some of us have grown up in churches. I certainly did, where when talking about the cross, the idea was that this is literally true. That on the cross, Jesus sort of takes on all of human sin. Like I remember even from youth group, like a picture of like a funnel over Jesus's head at the cross, and God pouring sin into the funnel and it just kind of dumping on Jesus. And because Jesus has become sin, he is so repulsive to God that God abandons him, that God turns away from Jesus at the cross, and that on the cross, Jesus dies alone. He dies abandoned by God the Father. He dies because he is covered in sin and God has looked away. Um, you might even sing songs sometimes in churches. The Father turns his face away, or other songs that will talk about the agony of the cross for Jesus, in addition to the physical pain, is that for the first time his Father has left him. His Father has abandoned him. And that when Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That's literally what happens. That the Trinity somehow shatters in two at the cross, and God the Father removes himself from Jesus the Son. Okay, so I want to push back on that in that theology, um, fully recognizing I grew up in that theology. In fact, for many years as an adult, when I was doing youth ministry, I told young people that that's what happened at the cross. Over time, I have come to really question that for two primary reasons. The first of which is connected to why I read those quotes in Luke. So, what was striking about them? Right here is Jesus dying on the cross, even at his very last moment, the moment before he dies in Luke. And what is he doing? He is talking to God, his Father. He is talking to God as if God is listening. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Right? The end, the culmination of his conversation with the two thieves is telling one of the thieves that today you will be with me in paradise. Right? And where is paradise? Who is paradise with? Today you will be in God the Father's presence. And that Jesus on the cross confidently is asserting, I know where I'm going to be in mere moments, and it's going to be in my Father's presence. And you, this thief that I have just met here in these moments, you'll join me. You will be with me. Right? Does that sound like somebody who believes that God has truly abandoned them, that God has turned away and left him? I don't think it does at all. Right? And then those final words. Jesus does not say, God, you have abandoned me, so now I die. Now I'm just going to give up because I'm alone, because you have turned your back on me. He says, Father, into your hands I give my spirit. this very clear sense that he still feels as if he is connected to God the Father. So that's the first reason. I think the way Jesus is portrayed in Luke seems, I believe, to distinctly contrast with any kind of idea that Jesus dies alone, that the Father is turned away from him. The second kind of textual reason is, and many of you are likely know this, and if you don't, many scholars have pointed this out. When Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He's quoting from the Psalms, right? He's not just making that up. Those are the first words from Psalm 22. And so I want to talk about Psalm 22 for a moment. So here's how it begins. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest. Right? So that first stanza of Psalm 22 sounds exactly like that theology, right? God, you have left me. You have abandoned me. But here's what comes next. And yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one that Israel praises. Our ancestors put their trust in you. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried out and they were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. Right? So if over here is, my God, why have you forsaken me? I'm alone. He follows that up with, but you have rescued our ancestors. When they felt alone, when they felt abandoned, you came and delivered them. But then Psalm 22 goes back to despair. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. And many people point out how directly Psalm 22 seems to describe Jesus's experience on the cross, right? And we're going to see that in just a moment. So again, we're back on this side. Like, God, you have left me, you have abandoned me. Why has this happened to me? Yet, you brought me out of the womb. You made me trust in you, even at my mother's breast. From birth I was cast on you. From my mother's womb you have been my God. Do not be far from me, for trouble is near, and there's no one else to help. Right? So now we have this contrast again, this trust. You not only have you been with my ancestors, you have been with me since birth, and I know that, and I trust that. Many bulls surround me, strong bulls of Bashan encircle me, roaring lions that tear their prey. Oh, they open their mouths against me. I am poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart is turned to wax. It is melted within me. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd. My tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death. Dogs surround me. A pack of villains encircle me. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. Like that's again, we're back now to despair, right? I am alone. I'm crushed. I'm like somebody being attacked by lions, attacked by wolves, attacked by bulls. They're tearing my body apart. People are laughing and ridiculing me. I'm alone. But you, Lord, do not be far from me. You are my strength. Come quickly to deliver me. Rescue me from the mouths of the lions. Save me from the horns of the wild oxen. I will declare your name to my people. In the assembly I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you descendants of Jacob, honor him. Revere him, all you descendants of Israel. For he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not lifted his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. Let me read that last stanza again. For he, God the Father, has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. So in my 20s, I began to encounter scholars who argue that on the cross, when Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? What he is doing is referencing not just the first line of Psalm 22, but all of Psalm 22. Remember at the beginning of the semester when we talked about the Shema, hear, O Israel, right? The Lord your God is one, this faith statement of all of Israel. But the way Jews reference it is by the first word. Remember that this is, in the Hebrew Bible in Jesus's day, they don't have chapters and verses to mark up. That comes much, much later, centuries later, by a priest in England, actually, who kind of goes through and puts the numeric markings that we have in our Bible. So how do you reference a text at this point? By saying the first line, by saying the first word, right? So if you want to say the Shema, you say Shema, O Israel, and Jews have memorized it. They know, oh, you're going to talk about all the stuff that, right? So scholars suggest that what Jesus is doing here is, like, I'm not going to quote all of Psalm 22. I don't really have any air to breathe, but I'm going to quote the first line. And my experience here at the cross is Psalm 22. It's this kind of dual experience. On the one hand, I'm physically experiencing something that feels like abandonment. I feel like I'm alone. I feel like I am forsaken. And yet, just as the psalmist, over and over again, in spite of the horrific circumstances he's in, returns to, and yet I know I'm not alone. I know you have not abandoned me. He has not forsaken the afflicted one. He has heard my cry, and he is present with me. Arguing that God, in fact, does not in any way abandon Jesus at the cross, that the Trinity is not torn apart for even a second at the cross, that God the Father is present until the end with Jesus, that as Jesus suffers at the cross, the Holy Spirit and the Father, the other two members of the Trinity, are present with him. Now, I want to acknowledge, excuse me, there's still certainly many Christians who do kind of believe in a theology of abandonment, that the Father does turn away at the cross. And you're welcome to still hold that. I'm not going to force you on the final to admit that you've left that belief or anything like that. But I do want you to understand the reasons why people question that. And I think the good reasons why people argue that that Jesus is not alone at the cross. That in Luke, as he continually references his Father in heaven, even to his very last words, or in Matthew, as he quotes, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He may well be, in fact, quoting the entire psalm. This psalm that talks about, in spite of all evidence that suggests you have forsaken me, I trust and believe that you have not, that I am not alone. So with that, we're going to kind of leave the cross. Jesus dies, his rib is pierced, his ankles typically would have been, his legs would typically be broken. That's kind of how they speed up the death of people on the cross, enabling, kind of taking away their ability to stand up and catch air. But Jesus dies so quickly, he doesn't even have to. His side is pierced by a spear by a Roman soldier to kind of show that his lungs are punctured, and out from it comes all this fluid in addition to blood, which confirms that's he's now dead. He can't breathe. His lungs have been filled. So Jesus is taken down from the cross, put in a tomb nearby, probably kind of a small cave, and a large rock is rolled over the mouth of this cave. And he's left there because it's almost sunset on Sabbath, right? So the Sabbath begins Friday. Jesus' friends need to get him buried quickly. They don't have time to kind of do the preparation for a proper, formal, honoring Jewish burial. So his body is just put in the tomb. And then we're going to see quickly that some women that are friends of his are going to want to come back and finish the job of burying him with honor and in proper Jewish custom after the Sabbath is over. So that's why there's this gap between sundown Friday and Easter morning. So we then pick up the story with Easter, right? So women come to the tomb. Now, one of the tricks of the Gospels is every Gospel agrees that the women are the first ones to witness the resurrection, right? Um, which is a really important point to make. Like I've said a few times in the course, like arguments against women preaching or being evangelists or being leaders in the church um, can't be based on this text or can't be based on that text. Well, here's another argument for women preaching. Who are the first Christian missionaries? Who were the first Christian evangelists? If the central idea of the gospel is that Christ has risen, he is risen indeed, that Jesus is no longer dead, that the cross does not hold Jesus, the first ones to tell this story are the women that come to the tomb. The Christian gospel begins with women preaching to others. These women are greeted at the tomb, and depending on the gospel, either by an angel who tells them, go and later on you'll see Jesus, or by Jesus himself. But in both cases, these women are told to go tell the men, go tell Jesus's disciples that Jesus has risen from the dead. But it's women who get this message. Obviously one of the kind of challenges of our reading of the Gospels is the fact that it's different combinations of women who arrive, and all of them Mary, most likely Mary Magdalene, not Mary, Jesus' mother, although in one gospel it's suggested that perhaps she is one of these women, but probably Mary Magdalene, who is a close friend. Mary and Martha had been two of Jesus' closest friends, and their brother Lazarus had been raised from the dead by Jesus. They appear at the tomb. And again, in one gospel, it's an angel that greets them. In others, it's Jesus himself who talks to him. So what I want to talk about is just a few kind of highlights of Jesus's body or existence after the resurrection, because one of the things you will hear sometimes is, okay, like I can believe that Jesus was this great moral teacher. I can believe that the Romans crucified him, but I can't believe in the resurrection, that he really literally rose from the dead. That's crazy talk. Like that just doesn't happen. You know, none of us, like if you've ever been to a funeral, none of us are sitting there going, we're going to have this, but in 2 days it's going to all go back to normal because this person's going to come back out of the grave. Death is final in that sense for most of us. But Christians believe, and at the heart of Christian teaching is that in Jesus's case, it was not, right? That Jesus bodily rises from the dead, that God brings him back to life. And why that is so central, like, at various points in the course, we've talked about, well, did the plagues, did God literally turn the Nile River to blood, or was that some kind of algae or ash that causes it to look red, and it's just amazing timing. Perhaps God uses nature. Well, like we've argued at different points in the class, that what if it's not essential to believe in this miracle as a snap of the finger? God does this. Like, what if God used natural, processes in the world, in nature, to bring about the plagues of Egypt or something? Still arguing that God did it, but that it maybe doesn't look quite the way we sometimes imagine it. What I want to stress is with the resurrection, that's not an option, at least within traditional Orthodox Christianity. Like Christianity calls us, and the early Christians from the very beginning believed that this was a miracle, that Jesus had risen from the dead, and that his body had risen from the dead. And so I want to talk about a few things that Christians over time have ruled out as, no, we can't think of it this way. So sometimes you'll see people say, well, maybe, uh, Jesus rose from the dead the way, like his memory stayed with us, right? I mean, sometimes like you'll see athletes, oh, my father died a week before the Super Bowl, and so in that big key play in the fourth quarter when I was, running down the field, I felt my Father's strength with me. It was if he was carrying me to the goal line, or my, a soldier in battle loses their close friend, and his presence was with me as I did this thing, or my grandmother was guiding me forward as I faced this challenge in life. And maybe that's what they were talking about. Maybe Jesus rose from the dead in that, like, he rose in our memories. He rose that he's alive in our heads and our hearts as we remember him, right? But that's not what the Gospels say. They don't say that. They don't say we treasured his memory, like the Last Supper. Do this in remembrance of me. That's not what they say. I mean, they say his body rose from the dead. And they died for this belief, right? Like church history, church tradition teaches us that literally all but one of Jesus's close disciples are killed by the Roman Empire for their belief in Christianity, right? So if all their if it's a lie, right? Like if oh well, really we just mean we love him a lot, so we talk about him, and he's alive up here in our heads. Why not say that and spare your life? Like, why be willing to be um, martyred, killed by the empire over your faith in the resurrection, if you do not truly believe the resurrection happened? Also, it's sometimes argued that, well, the early Christians actually, maybe they didn't really even believe that. Maybe just they start talking about the resurrection, like 200, 300 years later, when Christianity's become kind of like this big official religion and they need to make it impressive. And so, like, why should you be a Christian? Well, because our guy didn't just say a lot of wise things and teach a lot and live righteously. He actually conquered death, and that the resurrection is maybe like an invention of the church 200, 300 years later. But there's really all evidence suggests the opposite of that. Suggests that within weeks, within months, that the very earliest followers of Jesus are insisting that Jesus has risen from the dead. That they're at a time when you could prove it, right? 300 years later, you could make a crazy assertion like that. And who's gonna? How can you prove it wrong, right? Like nobody knows 300 years in, but a week in, 2 weeks in, okay, we'll just go dig up his grave. We'll just go dig up the bones, right? And yet the early Christians immediately begin talking about not just a Jesus who has died on the cross, but a Jesus who has risen from the dead. So it seems as if, whether they're right or wrong, the first Christians believed that this had happened, believed that Jesus was no longer dead, but had been brought back to life. So another argument you'll hear sometimes is that, well, maybe he just seemed dead, kind of like the Princess Bride argument. He's not, he's just mostly dead. But think about this. The argument being like that he went maybe into a coma and he somehow revived himself. Right. So this is a man who has been beaten. He's been whipped to the verge of death. He's hung on a cross. His ribs were, his side was pierced with a sword, a spear, to kind of demonstrate his lungs were filled with fluid. He's put in a cave. A massive stone, probably a couple thousand pounds, is rolled over his grave. And yet somehow, within 48 hours, he miraculously regains his strength and pushes this huge stone away, and somehow deals with the Roman soldiers that were guarding his tomb. That seems as crazy as believing that God could do something like this. What's harder to believe, that God could actually do this miracle, or that somehow he had just appeared to be dead and he had seemed as if he was crucified, but really he was just kind of in a coma and left to rest a little while. He comes back to strength and pushes his way out of it. Another argument you will hear is that he's a ghost, right? I mean, people all over the world believe in spirits, believe that they've seen, you know, the ghosts of their ancestors, the ghosts of people that have died in their communities, and spirits come to them and communicate with them. And maybe Jesus was just a ghost after the resurrection, and his spirit had not yet gone to God and had not yet left this earth, and somehow came and communicated with his friends, right? But again, that's not how the Gospels describe what happened. What they describe is a man who eats with them, right? And each of the Gospel stories, you have Jesus sharing meals, right? You know, tangibly eating food. People touch him. Very famously, Thomas, you know, who doubts that this has really happened. Jesus says, "Touch the wounds. Put your finger in my side. You know, feel my flesh, and see that I'm really alive. That I'm not a ghost." Again, that doesn't prove the resurrection, but it proves that the gospel writers didn't believe Jesus was a ghost. In fact, they're arguing strongly the opposite. Like, look, he had tangible flesh. He was real. Okay. One final argument is like, imagine the hysteria and stress and kind of emotional pressure that Jesus's followers would be in after, you know, their leader, their guru had died and died this horrible death, and they thought he was going to be a king. Maybe they could all kind of have a psychotic break under this pressure and hallucinate the resurrection. They hallucinate that Jesus has come back to life. And people do. I mean, people do. You know, if you're sleep deprived for days upon days, you can induce hallucinations. You know, certain foods, certain chemicals that you can ingest, certain drugs can bring about hallucinations. Um, but any study you ever read about that, like, and there are times when like, okay, everyone ate, you know, this certain food that was laced with a psychotic drug of some kind, and so, you know, like 100 people all had mass hysteria, mass hallucinations. What always happens though in that is that every person's hallucinations are unique. You know, one person sees spiders climbing on the wall and crawling all over them. Another person sees bats flying everywhere. Another person feels like they can fly. You know, like each person in a psychotic, you know, induced state like this would have their own unique hallucinations. And yet, what the Gospels talk about is crowds of people. Sometimes Jesus' friends in pairs or small groups, sometimes all of Jesus' disciples. At one point, up to 500 people interacting with Jesus and all having the same experiences with him. Again, doesn't prove the resurrection, but it kind of takes away the possibility of thinking of it as a hallucination. Like the early disciples are saying, no, we all saw him. We all He talked to us, and we all had the same experience with him. One thing that is interesting about Jesus post resurrection, I argued a moment ago that the Gospels point out that he's physical. His physical body is back to life. It's not just a ghost, it's not just a spirit or apparition of some kind. But he's different now, right? There's at least a couple things that seem very different about Jesus after the resurrection. One, he kind of moves through space and time in a new way, right? Prior to now, when Jesus travels from one place to the next in the Gospels, he does it like you and I do it. He walks. He physically moves his body, you know, and immediately in Mark, Jesus left this town and traveled with his friends to the next. And after the resurrection, that all changes, right? Some of the first interactions his followers have with him, they're all together in a room and the door is locked, and all of a sudden Jesus is present in their midst. His physical body is present, but they have no idea how he got there. And he talks with them, shares a meal with them, and then he leaves and is gone. And so, yes, his physical body is resurrected. Yes, it's the same body he had before, but there's also something different he moves through space and time in a new way that he had not previously done. Additionally, there's this strange kind of function that appears in the Gospels, the resurrection accounts, where it is Jesus, but people don't always recognize him. And that's unclear. Is that because they're not expecting it to be Jesus? Or does he is he able to kind of cloak his appearance? So at the tomb, Mary is speaking with Jesus, and she doesn't realize it. She's asking him, where have they taken him? What have they done with his body? And then Jesus says, Mary. And all of a sudden, like her eyes are open and she realizes it's Jesus talking with her. In Luke, there's two men walking on the road to Emmaus, which was a town in Palestine. And Jesus starts walking along with them. And they spend a whole day, kind of afternoon, having this conversation together. And then later at the end of the day, share a meal. And it's as Jesus breaks the bread at the meal that their eyes are opened and they realize it's him. That somehow they've been able to spend all day with him, talking about the events that have transpired, and they don't recognize him. So yes, he has a physical body, but it's somehow different. It's sometimes cloaked and unrecognizable. It's also removed through time and space differently. So I want to end quickly by talking quickly about in the last 10 minutes or so about two events in the Gospel of John that I think just kind of have pastoral significance for us. Okay, so there are two interactions that Jesus has post resurrection. The first one I've already alluded to, and that is Thomas, doubting Thomas, right? So when Jesus first appears, this is in John 20, when Jesus first appears to the disciples, Thomas, who is one of his close followers, isn't present. And so later on, his friends come upon, tell him, like, you're not going to believe what's happened. Jesus isn't dead after all. He has come back to life. And Thomas, probably like most of us would be, is incredulous. Like, I don't believe you. How could that be possible? Like, unless I see it for myself, unless I touch his body, I am not going to believe that this could happen. Like, I just can't accept this. And so, a couple days later, the disciples are together. Thomas is now with them, and Jesus suddenly appears, kind of another one of those out of nowhere appearances. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And then he said to Thomas, "Thomas, put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hands and put it into my side, to the wound where the spear pierced my side. Stop doubting and believe." And it's because of this story that, we have the phrase, "Oh, you're a doubting Thomas," right? Don't be like Thomas. Don't doubt. And Thomas didn't believe until he himself was able to touch Jesus. And in fact, Thomas is like, he's embarrassed, like, "Oh, my Lord and my God." And Jesus says, "Because you have seen me, you've believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and still believe." And certainly it is true. I mean, those that have kind of the gift of faith, that even, without proof, without evidence, I easily believe in God, that is a great thing. But here's the deal. John, right after this story, says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples that were not included in this book. But these stories are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah. Right? So the author of John is saying, like, I could have told you tons of other stuff, but I picked these stories because I thought they would help you have faith. I included these things. So why does the author of John include this story about Thomas? I think it's for this reason. I think Thomas is all of us, right? Maybe you've grown up in the church, maybe you've gone to church your whole life, and have been a Christian your whole life. But I bet every one of us has days where it's easy to believe, days where it's easy to trust, and other days where we don't. Other days when something horrible happens, when we feel alone, when we feel frightened, maybe in this time right now. and the economy is crashing, and we're all in isolation, and people are dying, and you know, maybe the story of Thomas is in here to say, just like Thomas, Jesus, how does Jesus treat Thomas? Does he say, get out, get away from my presence? I don't want anything to do with somebody that doesn't have total faith in me. No. He comes to Thomas and he says, Thomas, you're having a hard time believing. Let me help you. You need physical proof? Okay, touch me. And he kind of gently and pastorally, compassionately deals with Thomas's doubts. He doesn't tell them it's inappropriate or unacceptable to have them. He does say, like, hey, it would be great if you didn't, but you do. And so let me help. Right? And for those of us for whom faith maybe is hard sometimes, for whatever reason, because we've had experiences where theodicy of experiences of suffering, and we question whether God is present, or intellectually we've read some philosophical text or a science textbook, and how can God be real if science is real, or whatever the reasons are. I think rather than telling us, how dare you feel that, how dare you think that, never have doubts, never have questions, I think Thomas's story, and the fact that John includes it, tells us that God can handle your doubts. God can handle your questions, and that he gently does so with Thomas. The last story I want to quickly look at, and we don't have time to spend as much as I'd like with it, is a second immediately following story in the Gospel of John. So if you'll recall, the night Jesus is arrested, who 3 times denies knowing Jesus? Peter, one of his closest friends. Peter, who said, like, okay, all these other chumps, they might abandon you, they might forsake you, but not me. I'm your best disciple. I'm your truest friend. I will stay with you until the end. And yet within minutes of his arrest, Peter begins saying, not me, man, because he's scared, because he's frightened of what being identified with Jesus might mean. So 3 times, triple repetition, he denies Jesus. So there's this story that ends kind of the Gospel of John, where Peter and his friends are out fishing at the Sea of Galilee. And Peter has always been a fisherman. We first meet Peter in the Gospels. He's fishing and Jesus comes upon him, and there's a miracle that Jesus performs. And so again, Peter is out in the water with his friends, and they haven't caught anything. They've been fishing all night. They haven't caught anything, and they're kind of dejectedly coming into shore. And they look and they see on the shore somebody standing and calling out to them. And this person says, friends, have you caught any fish? No, they answered. And then the person on the shore says, throw your nets on the right side of the boat. Throw your nets on the other side from where you were fishing, and you'll find some, which is crazy advice, right? Like, if you're a professional fisherman, the secret isn't like, oh gosh, the reason we're not catching any tuna is we're just not throwing our nets on the right side of the boat. They're all hiding on the right side and not the left side. No, if the fish are out there, you're going to catch them off of either side. But this is a repeat of the miracle when Peter first met Jesus. The very first time, when they meet, Peter has had another night where he hasn't caught any fish. And Jesus says, well, let me help. Let's try throwing our nets on the other side of the boat. And they catch a ton of fish. And so Jesus repeats this kind of intimate detail from his history with Peter. And the disciples immediately kind of realize, like, that's Jesus. They throw their net on the other side of the fish, and they catch a ton. Like, just like the first time, Jesus miraculously provides all these fish. Peter recognizes it's Jesus and immediately dives out of the boat and starts swimming to shore. Like, he can't wait for, okay, we're going to pull in all the fish. We're going to, take our time. We'll come in. Jesus will be waiting there. He just jumps out of the boat and starts swimming towards Jesus. They gather on the shore with these fish. They have kind of a breakfast. They start a fire. They cook some fish. And then Jesus has this conversation with Peter. And 3 times, do you love me? And 3 times Peter says, yes, yes, I do, Jesus. You know that I love you. And when I was younger and first read this story, it kind of confused me. Like, why doesn't Peter trust Jesus? Or why doesn't Jesus trust Peter the first time? Why does he make him say it 3 times? Like, is he punishing him? Like, really? Like you don't have a very good track record. Are you really going to follow through? Are you really going to keep your word? Um, I don't think that's what it is. What had Peter done 3 times? He had denied loving Jesus. He had denied even knowing Jesus. And remember, in Jewish culture, triple repetition. It's one thing to say something once. If you say it 3 times, you have locked yourself in. You have bound yourself. Like, I give you my solemn, deepest word. This is what I think. Right? 3 times Peter had said, I abandon you, Jesus. So now what does Jesus do? 3 times he allows Peter to say, I love you, Jesus. I love you, Jesus. And again, why is this story in here? Why does John include it? Again, just like we're Thomas, I think you and I are also Peter, right? There are days, there are moments where we do love God, where we do love Jesus, where we, live and act as if our faith is the most important thing in our lives. But there's tons of times where we look a whole lot like Peter on the night of Jesus's arrest, right? Where when push comes to shove, am I going to do the right thing? Am I going to follow God or not? Am I going to have the courage to act in faith? And we don't. And just like Jesus came to Thomas and said, Thomas, I understand your doubts and I want to help. I think Jesus comes to Peter and says, Peter, I understand your faithlessness. I understand your fear and your cowardice. But I want to give you a second chance. I want to give you grace. I want to give you the opportunity to 3 times say the opposite and 3 times declare your love. And I think Jesus is merciful to Thomas and merciful to Peter, and he's equally merciful to you and I in our doubts and in our cowardice, in the moments where we follow God well with faith and courage, and in the moments where we abandon God and in doubt and in fear. Jesus is with us here for us. Thank you.